Good evening. Thank you very much for joining us. Those of you that joined us for Joey Newcomb, thank you for joining us there, and thank you now for joining us here with the next Joey Rosenfeld. My name is Yechiel Bressler. I am the Assistant Director of School Programming as well as a clinician for Madrigos Midwest. And I'll speak briefly just this year. We do many things at Madrigos. We have we meet with clients. We have the school curriculum, and we do enrichment and prevention. And one of the things we began this year is that we began an adult branch, a parenting branch. And this, of course, this series is the Parenting in a Pandemic series, which we've had so far 2 unbelievable presentations. And tonight we have a third, which I'm very excited for because Joey Rosenfeld, for anyone who knows him, is an absolutely brilliant individual, both and to listen to his shiurim as well as to listen to him as an expert on mental health and addiction in particular. And I have a personal connection as Joey lives in my hometown of St. Louis, or my previous hometown of St. Louis, where I grew up. Actually married my neighbor from growing up. So Joey and I go way back, and I've been searching to find a way to get Joey to be able to speak to the Chicago community. And I'm so grateful to Madrigos that we have this opportunity. And Joey is an LCSW who is a practicing psychotherapist with a focus on addiction, spirituality, and depth psychology. Joey utilizes the depths of Jewish spirituality in developing a model of recovery from substance abuse-related issues. He lives in St. Louis with his wife and 3 children. It is a privilege to call upon Joey. Joey is going to present, and afterwards there's a question and answer feature on the bottom. If you have questions throughout or at the end, we will have an opportunity to have an interactive component as well. So please, you can even ask anonymously. So please do not hesitate to do that as well. And thank you, Joey, so much for joining, and it's all yours.
Okay. Thank you so much, Yechiel. And thank you to Madrigos Midwest for giving me the opportunity to share and to share some insight. Not my own insight, but insight that I glean from teachers and books and things that I've applied in my professional life as well as in my own personal life. Now, in a broad stroke, the topic of tonight's discussion is going to be isolation and addiction. But what I want to give before I begin discussing the crux, which will ultimately be 3 simple suggestions of what I'm going to try and convey tonight, I want to start off with 2 somewhat of a public service announcement. Number 1, when speaking from a clinical posture, it's important for me to stress the fact that I am still speaking on an abstract level. So what I am offering right now is not necessarily to be taken and applied to particular crisis situations. And the approach, which is the appropriate approach and the responsible approach to any crisis-oriented situation, especially within the realm of addiction or substance abuse disorders, is to reach out to an acting clinician who has involvement in the individual's life or in your own life, or to contact whichever services are absolutely necessary. That being said, what I'm going to try and share has been tested in my own personal experience in the clinical background where I work. I run the spirituality aspect of a mid-sized substance abuse treatment center in St. Louis, where I have been able to utilize teachings from Judaism and teachings from Hasidus and Kabbalah and Machshava and all different streams of Jewish thought, and to test those ideas and to see how those ideas can be utilized in a therapeutic manner for individuals who have absolutely no access or prior engagement with anything Jewish, let alone Jewish knowledge. Second of all, when speaking about addiction, I always find it important to put addiction in scare quotes, because my personal clinical posture is that addiction is not something that simply affects individuals who suffer from a substance abuse disorder or any behavioral addiction or process addiction, but rather all of us as human beings. Part of the fabric of what it means to be a human being is to live within a certain context of what I have referred to in the past based on prior literature as the potential towards addiction. Addiction, in a grossly overgeneralized manner for the time that we have together, is any attempt that an individual engages in to alleviate the stresses or the difficulties of their life, and that behavior begins to lead to consequences, any type of consequences strong enough to serve as a proper barrier against that behavior. And in the addicted state, when a person is given over to that behavior, the consequences no longer stand in the way of the action, and the action overrides the consequences. Now, the typical conversations that we have with regards to addiction are substance abuse addiction. And the reason for that is because those are the most magnified forms of addiction. But on a certain level, all of us know what it means to experience addiction. All of us know what it means to feel a certain way that we want to escape from, whether that feeling is anxiety, whether that feeling is sadness, whether that feeling is an overwhelmingness over what happens next, whether it's a feeling that has lingered with us from childhood, or whether it's something that has emerged suddenly in the midst of our lives. Each and every one of us as human beings understand the feelings of wanting to feel differently. Now, it's not because we're broken or because there's something wrong with us, it's because we're human beings, that human beings naturally, and our Svarim tell us this as well as our psychologists, that part of the human condition is to experience the intensity of life. Life is an intense thing. Life is not a cool spring that runs along a beautiful mountainside, but rather life is raging waters very often, with ups and downs and turns that are relatively unexpected and profoundly unexpected. So when speaking about addiction, if you have an individual in your life who experiences the mental illness of addiction as described in the DSM-5 or a psychiatric diagnosis of a substance abuse disorder, then these words can certainly be applied to that experience. But even for those individuals who don't necessarily have contact with addiction, who don't necessarily know the empathy, the sympathy, or the experience of addiction itself, these ideas are meant to be general in the sense that they speak to the place in all of us that feels the burden of life and that seeks to escape it very naturally, to find a way out of that pain. Now, one of the elements of addiction that theorists point to as both an origin place of addiction, meaning a set of behaviors that can give birth to the experience of addiction, as well as a symptom of addiction, is the notion of isolation. Now, the fact that it is found at the outset of addiction as well as in the midst of addiction simply means that it's a different type of isolation, which we're going to discuss. That the isolation that the individual who is struggling experiences morphs into something different as it traverses along the bylines and the veins of the experience of addiction. Now, in order to clarify the terms that we're going to be utilizing, at least for my sake, I'm not necessarily speaking about physical isolation or even social isolation. All of us find ourselves right now in some sort of isolation. Some people experiencing isolation in a profoundly potent way of being alone. Others, a slightly less form of isolation of being alone with family members or alone with loved ones. But all of us, collectively, individually, are living in a time period right now, an unexpected, almost traumatic time period. Not almost traumatic. I believe that this is traumatic and that it's going to take us a long time and a lot of courage to be vulnerable enough to look back on this time period as just Hashem when it passes, to try and come to terms with what we found in this experience. But isolation is less of a social or physical reality as much as it is a mindset. Different tzaddikim, different theorists, different rabbis have pointed out, and anybody who's interested in sources afterwards, I'm more than happy to share, that loneliness and isolation are states of the mind. That a person can be in a room filled with 100 people, all there for the same purpose. But if a person feels disconnected from themselves, if a person doubts themselves, if a person has low self-esteem or no self-efficacy in themselves, then no matter how many people I am with, no matter how many social connections that I have, ultimately, when I enter into the core of myself or into the mind of myself, I can't help but feel that feeling of being alone. That loneliness can be understood in two ways, either that nobody can understand me or nobody wants to understand me. And when it comes to helping somebody who finds themselves struggling with isolation, it's very important to understand this distinction of either nobody can understand me, almost as if my experiences are unique, or that I am singular, or that my suffering or my pain is different than anything anybody else in the history of the world has experienced. Or on the other side, it's nobody wants to understand me. I am alienated. I have pushed away the people that love me, whether it's as a result of my low self-esteem or the result of actual behaviors that I've engaged in. Very often a person feels that nobody wants to pay attention to them. Now, these states of isolation, this sense of being alone, this sense of living stuck within the self with no recourse to express what is hurting me, what is exciting me, or this psychic tension and pressure that grows within an individual no matter what state of life they're in, when it does not have a space of expression, when communication breaks down because a person is no longer given the openings of other people in their life, that pressure turns inwards. One of the rules of the mind that a very bright Jewish thinker, Sigmund Freud, taught us is that the mind operates very much like a cup. What goes in must come out. If it went in there and you don't see it anymore, it's very important not to assume that it's gone. It's still there. It's just pushed underneath. But those things that we repress, those feelings that we repress and we push away as a result of our fear or just because of our inability to express them, they still need to be dealt with. So if I am experiencing emotional discrepancies or painful experiences or anxieties or whatever it is that goes through the mind of anyone, especially the potential addict or the addict themselves, especially at a time period that is cut through with anxiety over the future in all sorts of ways, it's important to understand that that tension grows. And without recourse to express it, it can lead a person to try and seek out comfort externally. Addiction, in contradistinction to the typical perspective of addiction, which is that the addict or the alcoholic or the potential addict enjoys getting high or drunk on illicit substances more than the other person, and therefore they continue their behaviors. That faulty vision of addiction, which has led so many people to apply a punitive approach, to try and punish the individual who is suffering from addiction. The truth of addiction is not that the addict or the alcoholic or the potential addict or any of us desires pleasure more than anybody else. It's just that we're slightly more uncomfortable in our sober state, that the awareness of the self is uncomfortable for some reason. It hurts. And when something hurts, the natural thing is to seek relief. And when we don't find the typical balms or medications, proverbial medications, which mean communication or relationships or activities to settle us or to make us feel better, so then naturally we seek out stronger medications or stronger possibilities of relief. Until, for example, the alcoholic or the addict finds this substance, and the first time they use that substance, they feel, wow, I don't feel that pain anymore. I don't feel that tension. I don't feel that homesickness. I don't feel that itch that I don't know how to scratch. And again, this is all of us. This is not just addicts or alcoholics. This is all of us. And so when there's somebody in our lives that we love or ourselves who's struggling because they don't have recourse to express that tension that grows within themselves, either because they don't believe that anybody could understand it, or they don't believe that anybody wants to understand it, the most important thing that we can do for them or for ourselves is to learn how to communicate, is to learn how to find an opening for that relief that comes out of the divine gift of speech. Now, we're still in Lag BaOmer for some parts of the world. And one of the elements of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and what he was coming to teach the world is the power of speech. Throughout the Zohar, in contradistinction to the Gemara, before a remark or before a conversation, in the Gemara it says, Tashma, come and hear, come and listen to what this person has to say. In the Zohar, though, it's Pasach Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon opened his mouth. Or any of the other tzaddikim in the Zohar, they opened their mouth. And that opening of the mouth doesn't simply mean that they opened their mouths to speak. It means that they found an opening within themselves to express what needed to be expressed so desperately. Almost as if I can't express this right now, I'm going to be in pain. So Pasach Rabbi Shimon means that they found an opening through which to convey their human experience. And that is going to be the element, that gift of speech is going to ultimately be the element that enables us to move out of isolation, or to help somebody move out of the mindset of isolation. Whether it's us learning how to speak to ease our pain, or us learning how to listen to ease somebody else's pain, our job is going to be to learn how to speak properly, or the goal of speech. Now, the word addiction is an interesting word. Based on its Latin root, it actually means indentured servitude, that a person is given over to some power greater than themselves. The drug or the drink or the behavior or whatever force in their lives is detrimental. Somebody owed a certain amount of money and they were incapable of paying that sum back. They were forced into indentured servitude in order to repay that debt. And the word for that state was addictus, which is the Latin root of the word addicted, which means that somebody who experiences addiction is simply somebody who is engaged in being stuck under the power of a certain behavior. But there's another way to read the word. Diction, as in dictionary, is the way that we convey ourselves, is the language, is the sum total of the words that we use to express our human experience, how we transform what is inside to the outside. When you place an A in front of a word, what it represents is the negation of that word. Atypical, which means that it's not typical. So if we want to look at the word addiction, you can read it as addiction, as the negation of speech, as the loss of the ability to express what is at the heart of my experience. That every addict, every potential addict, every person has a story to tell, has something to share, has a burden that they need to unburden themselves of, has baggage that they need to put down. But if we feel that our mouths are stuck because nobody cares or nobody wants to understand, and I don't open my mouth, then that burden grows. So if addiction on a certain level is the breakdown of my capacity to communicate what is bothering me, which leads me to seek comfort elsewhere, then movement out of addiction in our own personal lives and in the real life stories of addiction is going to be learning how to speak, learning how to express ourselves. Now, what I want to try and express right now on a level of practical eitzah is going to be 3 approaches to how to deal with this problem of isolation, which, as we said, is the belief that either nobody can understand me or nobody wants to understand me. The first approach is simply going to be the power of speech, of opening our mouths. At the outset of the therapeutic project, at least as Sigmund Freud perceived it, Psychotherapy was referred to as the talking cure, which meant that it was really not so much about what the therapist or the loved one or the caretaker had to say in response to my problem, as much as it was my capacity to express my problem in words. That dibor, language, my capacity to speak, to talk, is already in and of itself an element of the cure. Because when I keep myself silent, ne'elamti dibor, or the kvedus hapeh, that heaviness of the mouth that Moshe Rabbeinu had, I feel the burden of my experience so deeply that it pains me every time I think about it. But when I learn to speak and when I learn to share, and when I learn to speak out my problem, or whatever it is that's bothering me, there's a catharsis, there's a relief that comes out of it. Catharsis, at least in my humble opinion, can best be understood as that feeling when you inhale and you hold your breath for a little bit longer than you feel comfortable. And then you hold it even longer. And you begin to feel that pent-up pressure in the chest, that discomfort. On a psychological level, it's a constriction of sorts. It's a sense that I don't have anywhere to move, a claustrophobia of the mind. And then you finally allow yourself to exhale. That moment of exhalation, where you transition from constriction into expansiveness, of min hametzar karasika, from that constricted place I call out to God. That moment of relief is what catharsis is, where I translate what is stuck inside of me outside. When we begin to view language and conversation in this way, it stops being so much about the response that we need to give somebody else, or the response that I am looking for, and it becomes much more centered and focused on the simple reality that I am speaking. I am expressing myself. If we're dealing with somebody who feels isolated and they're feeling stuck in their addictive tendencies or maladaptive behaviors, whatever they might be, addiction can be to anything. It could be to television, to video games, to computer games, to eating, to food, and then to more illicit experiences. Pornography, sexuality, drug addiction, drug abuse, alcoholism, the whole gamut. But when we allow somebody to speak and we create an open space of vulnerable listening without judgment, without necessarily even responding, but giving them space to speak, especially if it's our children who are struggling, because either they feel that they can't be understood or nobody cares about understanding what they're going through. By giving them that space where they are heard, what we do is we allow them to express themselves. And in that expression, or in our expressing ourselves, we find a certain level of relief. The Piazetzner Rebbe, Hashem Yimkom Domo, Rav Kalanimus Kalman Shapira, writes in his personal diary that he wrote in hell, that he wrote in the Warsaw Ghetto, Tzav V'Ziras. He writes that everybody needs somebody to talk to. Like the pasuk in Mishlei says, "Da'aga b'levish yasichenu la'acherim." If there's worry or anxiety in the heart of the individual, speak it out to somebody else. And what the Piazetzner Rebbe continues, and he says, all of us have somebody who is always willing to listen. We have a family member, we have a higher power, we have Hashem, we have friends, we have family. All we need to do is open our mouths. So the first eitzah, in terms of how to deal with that isolation, or that lonely feeling that I am misunderstood or nobody cares about me, or nobody wants me because I feel broken or thrown away for all of the different reasons. We don't have enough time now to speak about why we feel that way. But if there's another opportunity to speak to the chevra and to the community, then we'll identify some of those aspects as well. But the general reality is that everybody needs a safe space to speak. Somehow we have taken the natural human need of speaking out our vulnerabilities, and we have pathologized it and applied it only to those people who insurance is willing to cover them. Everybody needs a therapist, because the therapist can be the air. The therapist is anything that's willing to listen. And when we listen, let us suspend our judgment. More often than not, our children, our friends are not looking for insight. They're looking for a compassion and an empathetic listener. The second tool for individuals who are finding themselves stuck in some sort of isolated sense is again going to be a practical one. And I'm setting myself up for two practical pieces and then more of an abstract, almost spiritual practice that can benefit us. This is going to be utilizing the tools at our recourse right now. One of the elements that the world and the Jewish community at large has responded to this crisis in such a profound sense is our utilization of the tools at our disposal. When face-to-face communication is no longer accessible to us, when direct connection, when human contact, at least as we are used to it, is no longer accessible to us, instead of saying, as some people assume we should say, it's gefährlich, it's broken, there's no hope, what we have done is proverbially taken those lemons and turned it into lemonade, to be trite. We have taken technology, we have taken those tools at our disposal, and we have created a virtual community. In the absence of human connection, we have descended into a space where we are connected by way of a distance. And on a very practical level, if somebody feels isolated, or we feel that our children are isolated, and that isolation, that fear of being disconnected or alone or lonely, or not being cared about enough, or not being understood, we need to utilize the tools at our disposal. If it means a Zoom session with a friend, if it means a Zoom session with a loved one, if it means that very difficult task for many people of picking up a cell phone or a house phone and making a phone call. Even text messaging on a certain level is better than nothing. Simply because panim el panim is no longer necessarily accessible to us doesn't mean that communication goes out the window. There are a profound amount of resources at the tips of the Jewish community right now. Hotlines and crisis hotlines, and people who are willing to listen. People who are always willing to listen. It's important to understand that there is always somebody who is willing to listen to what we are going through. And even though we want to live a lechatchila life, even though we want things to go as we assume they should be, or as we want them to go, that's what we always like to do, right? We like to impose our will on Hashem. And what we're experiencing now collectively and individually is that our will doesn't mean anything. What we want doesn't necessarily have an impact on the reality of our experience. And sometimes Hashem reveals that His will is going to be the way. It's a revelation that reveals what it truly is all the time. But what we can do when we find ourselves in situations like that is push forward with the tools or those sparks of insight that are given to us. If we can't live that lechatchila life that we want to engage in real communication with human experience and gatherings which we're so used to, then let us dive headfirst into the bidi eved, into what is in front of us, the virtual reality of Zoom, of phone calls, of conversations. Because on a certain level, and our tzaddikim teach us this in a very delicate way, when the lechatchila breaks down, when the ideal breaks down, and we're forced to live in a time where things are not ideal, and we find hope in the reality of the situation in the bidi eved, if we're mindful enough, if we pay attention enough, we come to find that the bidi eved is also lechatchila. That learning how to deal with isolation by way of a distance, learning how to function as parents of children who are stuck in close quarters, that gives birth to a profoundly powerful and potent relationship, which we may not even see the fruits of for many, many years. But suffice it to say that, at least according to all of the books in back of me, and all of the books in all of our libraries, and all of the books in the Batei Midrashim and the shuls that remain closed, And the message of that scroll, that Torah which we stand at the ready to receive as a people, is that even they also carry with themselves a lechatchila at their heart. That we're learning how to communicate in a different way right now. And thirdly, and this is slightly more abstract, and I hope it's okay for me to be more abstract. I don't see any faces, so it's hard for me to read any emotions right now, so I'll continue. Is that, and before I say this, I want to express even stronger now that if there's a real experience of addiction and substance abuse going on that needs clinical attention, this is not an attempt to spiritualize or diminish in any way the severity and the reality of that mental health experience. Applying spiritual tools to psychological problems is a way of treating problems. It's a gift, it's a way of treating problems, but it does not mean to claim chas v'shalom that spirituality should overpower the symptoms. The symptoms are real, symptoms are very real. Mental health is as real as physical health. But spirituality and kedusha and holiness and our tradition offers many, many insights that we wouldn't typically look at. Bedidus, or aloneness, or isolation, doesn't need to be a crucible of suffering. It doesn't need to be this crucible where we see how long we can tolerate it. Bedidus can also be a base medrash for encountering perhaps the most important piece of the Torah, which is ourselves. Rav Yerucham Lubavitz, Schusei Ganalenu of Mir, one of the greatest psychologists to have ever lived, in my humble opinion, quite literally, and that's a secondary claim to fame for him, states that HaPerush Hachi Tov Ba'olam LaHaTorah Hu Ha'adam Atzmo, that the greatest commentary on the Torah is the individual themselves. For Rav Yerucham, you see throughout his writings this concept of atzmi, or atzmo, that on a certain level, the deepest truth of the Torah is when a person is capable of encountering themselves. That's not a comfortable idea for many of us. We're driven to distraction nearly every moment of our lives. Because if we're not distracted and we're bored, that means that we're paying attention to ourselves, and very often we don't like what we find. Either because we don't like what we've been told about ourselves, or because we've learned to believe negative things about ourselves, which are simply not true, but we've accepted them as truth. And the base medrash for that is learning how to be alone. My Rabbi, Rav Moshe Weinberger Shlita, spoke recently on a video that I saw that the avoda, the divine worship of this time period is learning how to be alone, is learning how to be like David HaMelech, that individual who learned how to cry out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu specifically because of his aloneness. Our tzaddikim point out that the word for isolation, badad, alone, isolated, is also an acronym Rosh Tevos for B'chol Derachecha De'ehu. In all of my ways I shall know him. In all of my ways I shall come and encounter God. Which means even in those parts of myself that I don't like, even in those parts in my children that I'm uncomfortable with. When we parade ourselves around in communities and we engage in this social comparison that as human beings we naturally engage in, we can't help but be embarrassed or shamed of our blemishes or the children's blemishes or what are perceived blemishes. And now that we're cooped up in our own space, we can arm ourselves with the possibility of accepting our blemishes, of accepting the difficulties that our children are going through, of no longer judging harshly, but rather responding empathically, offering an ear to listen. To be alone with Hashem, to be alone with oneself is something that Rabbi Nachman of Breslov spoke about more than anybody else. He described the spiritual practice of hispodidus, of being alone, of being lonely, of being isolated, and transforming that into an encounter with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's nobody else to distract us. There's nobody else to block us. It's us and God. It's us and our loved one. It's us and our child. It's us and ourselves. And when we begin to speak to ourselves, and we begin to speak to Hashem, and we begin to speak to our children, when we realize that nobody else is looking, nobody else has ever been looking, it's only us. One of the deepest truths that I've ever learned in my life, and it's a lesson that I learned from my mother, and she should live and be well to 120. She used to dress us in funny clothes, in cuffed shorts and yellow vests, up to the age of like 11, I think. And I used to say to her, I said, Mommy, I don't like how I look. I'm embarrassed. I probably said it in harsher terms. And one day my mom turned to me and she said, you know, sweetheart, nobody's looking at you. Nobody's looking at you. And it was something that remains with me till today. Most of the time we assume that everybody is looking at us. The truth of the reality is that Hashem is looking at us and we're looking at ourselves. And isolation provides us with the opportunity to actually encounter ourselves through the practice of hisbodedus, of talking out loud to Hashem, letting Hashem be our therapist. That's simply what hisbodedus means. You don't have to be in a field. You don't have to be a breast liver. You don't have to have payas or a beard. It simply means using Hashem as your therapist. If it makes you feel more comfortable, put money in a tzedakah box beforehand, and that will be like paying a therapist. And so these three eitzos, these simple eitzos, in the time period that I was given to speak, are the way to confront this isolation that so very rarely causes us difficulty, or an overwhelming sense of needing to escape ourselves. To speak to other people without a need to hear an answer. To utilize the tools that are in front of us, even if it's uncomfortable, to push through. Speaking on Zoom, speaking on a telephone is difficult, but if you do it 2 or 3 times, it becomes rote. That's the beauty of the habituated nature of human beings. And then most importantly, to find that spiritual potency that allows us to transform isolation into solitude. To realize that I am enough. My experiences are real and I don't need any relief outside of myself. And Be'ezras Hashem, what we should be able to do is we should learn how to speak more clearly about ourselves and what we're feeling, to listen more consciously and mindfully to what somebody else might be experiencing, and to talk more authentically about what we're feeling at this difficult time. Because there's no rule books for any of this. It's okay to feel what you're feeling. It's okay to wonder why I'm feeling these things. Nobody's judging it. Our job is to accept ourselves and to accept Hashem into our lives so that we can transform isolation into something more powerful, which is an encounter with ourselves, with the other person in our life, or with God. And so I think that there's time now for questions as well. If anybody has any questions on anything that I said or any questions about anything else, I hope what I said was meaningful. I don't know if I approached the topic in the way that it was desired to be. This is my nakuda on the topic.
Thank you, Joey, so much. It was perfect. Exactly. It's always meaningful. So thank you so much for your amazing insight as always. We do have a couple of questions, and I remind everyone that, again, you can definitely ask, enter into the question and answer feature on the bottom. And if necessary, you can definitely ask it anonymously and it will not be seen by anyone. So please do not hesitate to ask away. First question is, does hisbodedus naturally bring to a deeper appreciation of myself? Sometimes I am afraid that spending time alone in the quiet will highlight my own frustrations with myself.
Great question. Great question. The rules of there's certain halachos of how a person has to approach private time with themselves. And one of the first halachos is that a person has to judge themselves favorably. You know, if a person talks negatively about themselves or speaks lashon hara about themselves, which our tzaddikim point out is more difficult than lashon hara about other people, then there's no limit to the difficulty that we'll confront or the imaginings about our low self-esteem that we'll confront. That time when we're alone is the time to accept ourselves unconditionally, or as humanist psychologists would describe, or really client-centered care is focused on, is what is referred to as unconditional positive self-regard. That is halacha aleph of entering into a space of hisbodedus. I can spend the rest of the day judging myself unfavorably, the rest of the day pointing out my flaws, but those moments where I choose to actively engage in quietness and aloneness with Hashem or with myself, it's incumbent on me to overcome my natural and all too human tendency to feel low about myself and uncover positive points within myself. As long as I am still breathing, there is more right with me than there is wrong with me. And I need to believe that deeply before I enter into that alone space. Because otherwise it's not dangerous, it's just going to highlight simply what's the thoughts in a person's mind. Goal of hisbodedus is to stop myself so much, express myself to the extent that I realize that I feel much lighter than I did originally. And so, yeah, the tendency or the possibility of judging ourselves unfavorably or highlighting difficult points within ourselves, which I'm not saying never has a time. Cheshbon HaNefesh is also very important, but hisbodedus is not the time for that. Hisbodedus is about expressing the positive points within myself.
Amazing. Thank you. We do have a couple more questions, and
Sure.
we appreciate them coming. So how does what Bill Wilson explains what addiction is differ for the non-addict that is going through something as well?
Great question. Again, for anyone who's not familiar, Bill Wilson was one of the founding members of Alcoholics Anonymous, along with Dr. Bob. Bill Wilson was an interesting person, and his perception of addiction, I think it's important to show, is not simply his own folk narrative of addiction, but rather it is deeply rooted in psychotherapeutic traditions like Carl Jung and philosophy of William James, as explicitly stated. On a certain level, I wouldn't say that it differs so much. I tell my clients all the time that Alcoholics Anonymous or individuals in recovery are looking at the world situation right now and saying, well, what's everyone getting so crazy about? This is how we live our lives typically, without power or realizing that we're not in control. And totally, there was only one other 12-step program, which now number in the hundreds, who were interested in utilizing the 12 steps for their purposes. And they wrote a letter to Bill W. asking explicit permission. And that was Emotions Anonymous. That was people who felt that they struggled with emotions, which just highlights in an anecdotal sense how far-reaching these concepts are. But they don't simply apply to addicts or alcoholics. The only difference is that addicts and alcoholics need it, or their behaviors can destroy them, chas v'shalom. And other people are not so bothered by their problems. And so if they're not paying attention to spirituality or mindfulness or powerlessness or self-assessment or personal prayer, so then they'll just be slightly a little bit more uncomfortable in their lives. But the addict or the alcoholic needs it. So I would say, in my humble opinion, and again, there's a lot of literature to support this, that Bill W.'s conception of addiction as a spiritual malady applies to all human beings as part and parcel of the human condition.
Great. Thank you. We'll take one or two more if that's okay. What do you suggest for someone that finds it very difficult to talk to Hashem if they feel they can't do it honestly?
Great question. It's a great question, and I think it's probably what most people feel. So there's a couple of answers that I would give. On a certain cognitive behavioral therapeutic model, wherein we try and allow the action to influence the way that we feel, based on what the Sefer HaChinuch says, that the pu'ulos hachitzonios me'orer ha'pnimius, that external actions will awaken the inner experience, or what Chazal have described as mitoch shelo lishma balishma, out of inauthentic behavior, I come to authenticity. So first, the best answer is just speak, even if you're uncomfortable. Speak. Speak without action. Allow yourself to express what needs to be expressed, that even we don't know that needs to be expressed. Secondly, you can write your prayers out, you can write your thoughts out, which sometimes is more accessible for a person. A blank piece is always willing to respond to your thoughts. And third, what I would recommend is utilizing Tehillim, actually. Because Tehillim is David HaMelech speaking to Hashem on his own. If we can find ourselves the voice of David HaMelech, when David HaMelech is expressing that existential or terror or dread over what's coming next, or that incapability of dealing with anything, or feeling like he's drowning in waters, so we can find ourselves in the words of David HaMelech, then we will find expression to thoughts that we didn't know that we had. But my first eitzah, or not my first eitzah, the eitzah of teachers and tzaddikim, is even if you don't feel you can, to force yourself to speak. And eventually the flow will come.
Thank you. So
Phil, I'm sorry, I don't know if I heard.
no problem. We're good. We're good. So we'll take one more question and then we'll let you go. If a parent is confronted with a situation of a child who is involved in whatever the addiction is, on any of the things you mentioned or otherwise, or whether it's a parent or any other loved one, but that individual is not ready or is not at this moment opening up about it, what is the role of that parent, and how can that parent help the child progress even if the child is not coming to them first?
A wonderful question. And what I would say, if it's a child, and child is, means many things. It doesn't simply mean somebody under the age of 18. It depends what the behavior is. If it's a dangerous behavior, and there's a difference between a negative behavior, an illegal behavior, or a behavior that is looked down upon versus a dangerous behavior, and that's an important distinction to be made. A normal example would be that opiates or pills or medication that are being abused clearly carry with themselves an existential threat to the person's life, as opposed to some other forms of recreational drug usage or recreational activity that may be frowned upon in a spiritual or religious context. If there's danger involved, I personally believe that it's always better to err on the side of caution and to breach that individual's trust and to confront them, whether it's with a professional or whether it's with somebody that individual respects. But some of the drugs that or behaviors that people are engaged in are so dangerous that sometimes they have their negative effect way before a person even expects it to come, God forbid. But if it's something that is not seen as dangerous, if it's something that is not life-threatening, so to speak. And again, I'm speaking in broad strokes. It's difficult for me to apply any specifics to the circumstances without knowing. But I think that depending on the healthy type of relationship, you have a healthy relationship with your child and a trusting relationship with your child, I think it is okay sometimes to broach that conversation. My humble opinion is the conversation should never come out of a place of punitive retribution or anger, or how could you do this, or how could you embarrass me, or how could you have betrayed us like this? Because if a child or a loved one is engaged in a behavior that betrays somebody that they love, It's not because they don't care about the person that they love. It's because that behavior has become so important to them that it trumps and overpowers any other responsibilities in their life. And so to approach it from a place of connection and love, not approval, but love, and a willingness to be present for them in their process. Now, that doesn't mean accepting the fact that they will engage in that behavior. Every parent has the right to determine what they will allow in their house or what they won't allow in their house. And there's really no rule book for that, because each and every person is going to have their own individualized perspective. But I believe that the general sense, if there's a safe enough relationship, then to approach it out of love and kindness, to say, what's going on? I'm here for you. Is there something you want to speak about? And the child will either be very ready to speak, or they won't be ready to speak. But if it's a detrimental behavior and the relationship is not very strong, that's where I would say it gets a little bit more complicated. And as much as I would like to pretend that I have an answer at the tip of my lips as to how to approach that, I don't. It's delicate. My first recommendation would likely be to contact a mental health professional and to express whatever the problem might be so that you can get more direct information. I don't want to, God forbid, offer kind of a blanket statement that doesn't do justice to the severity of the problem. But in the situation of a good relationship, I would suggest open, loving communication.
Amazing. Joey, thank you so much for this opportunity. And we look forward to continuing the relationship and having more opportunities to hear from you and to learn from you. I would like to make two closing points. One is that this is recorded, and if anybody has anyone who, we know it is a sensitive topic, but if there's someone who in some way may benefit from this talk, the recording will be posted and will be available for anyone who is interested. Additionally, we will be back same time next week with Mrs. Michal Cohn at Tuesday night at 9 p.m. The topic will be managing relationship in close quarters. Thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you again, Joey, and always a pleasure to see you and learn from you. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.